So when you're launching a new product to replace an existing product, it's really easy to see where you're going, to rally behind the mission, to make the right technical decisions that will get you over the line. But after the launch, things can very easily lose focus. The vision might not be as clear as it once was. Corners that you cut to get over the line might be coming back to bite you, and the tech can start to really feel like it's kind of drifting off track. I've lived through those difficult teenage years on two major sites. The ft.com rebuild, which replaced the previous ft.com site, and the gov.uk launch, which in 2012 replaced the previous direct.gov site. If you live in the UK, you might recognize that orange. My name is Anna Shipman. I am the Tech Director for Customer Products at the Financial Times, which means I'm responsible for the ft.com site and the mobile apps. And I'm going to tell you a bit about the ft.com rebuild, how I recognise that we're in the difficult teenage years, and what we're doing to get out of them and what you can do as well. First of all, I'll tell you a little bit about the Financial Times. It's a newspaper. It's the pink one. If you don't know anything about the Financial Times, you might think it's just finance and business news, but it's not. It's a regular newspaper. It's got news, international news, culture, fashion. We pride ourselves on a high standard of journalism and holding power to account without fear and without favour is our motto. The website and the apps are subscription services. Oh, sorry, actually, I was going to talk about this. So this is a story that you might have seen from the FT, which was last year. There was a charity dinner called the President's Club, which is a men-only charity dinner, and it was very seedy. And the Financial Times did an expose, which ultimately led to it being shut down. So that's a story that we did that you might have seen. The website and the apps are subscription services, so they're behind a paywall. And this is what the ft.com site used to look like. There were a few technical issues with it. It was a monolith, and it took a long time to deploy, and it could only be deployed out of hours. And the releases were only monthly. There didn't seem to be a way to get to any kind of continuous deployment. The site was very slow, and it also wasn't responsive at all. So the image I showed you is what it looked like on the mobile, but just very small. There was also an organizational problem with it, which is that nobody had ownership of the whole thing. So different parts of the business owned different parts of the site, but there was no one with oversight for the coherence of the tech and of the look of it. So a small team worked on a prototype of what a new site might look like. They called it Next, and it became clear that this was going to be the future direction of the FT, and the team got bigger. And started building this site that was going to replace the existing ft.com website. The new site was much more modern architecture. It was microservices, it was Node.js, it still is, with a focus on speed, both of the site and speed of shipping, and focus on shipping regularly and measuring everything. So it was rolled out to users, and users were given the opportunity to opt in, and 5% of the subscribers opted into the beta, and so it was developed in the open with those users. It was launched to everyone. It was rolled out to more than those 5% users. It was rolled out widely in October of 2016. So it's much better now. It ships hundreds of times a week. It is much faster, and I'll talk more about that in a second. And it's got an A/B testing framework built in. It allows measurement, so we measure a lot of things at the FT, but the new site, or relatively new site, allows much quicker measurement of those things. So one of the things we measure is engagement. We have a metric called RFV, which is recency, frequency, volume. So how recently you visited the site, how often you visit, and how much you read when you're there. And we have an algorithm, and put those in, and it comes out with a figure, which is your engagement score. And we found that if your engagement score is 18.2 and above, when it comes time to renew your subscription, you are significantly more likely to renew than if it's lower than that. So that means we can focus our attention on things that will get you over the line, things that will get you from, 17 to 19, because that means that that's where we can get revenue, we can get subscriptions. So we have this A/B testing framework built into the new site. And so what that means is we can roll out, or so we can try new features with a cohort of users, and then we can see what impact that has on their engagement score. And if it does have a good impact, if it seems to be moving in the right direction, we can roll it out to all users. But if it's not, we can roll back. So that means we can test features in production and then ultimately never roll them out. So that's really good for getting fast feedback of what it's worth to deliver, what it's worth rolling out, and also making sure that we just don't have loads of features that aren't actually adding any value to our users. So another thing that the measurement allowed us to do is demonstrate the value of the speed of the site. So there was an experiment in the beta where we actually slowed down the page load for cohorts of users. And then measured what impact that had on the number of articles they read. So when the site was 1 second slower, I think I can point. Can you see that? When the site was 1 second slower, after a week, it was they read about 5% less, about 5% fewer articles, and this was maintained after about a month. So it wasn't like you got used to the site being slower, you carried on reading less. 2 seconds slower, the effect was increased, and it actually was about 5% there, but that wasn't statistically significant, so I haven't included that, but it was about 5%. And then 3 seconds slower, it was as much as 7 or 8%. So this is kind of obvious. I don't think it will surprise any of you to know that if the site is slower, you're going to read less. But this is it's really clear, it's actual data that shows that the slower speed does mean that people read fewer articles. And because we also have advertising, fewer articles viewed means fewer adverts displayed, means millions less revenue for us. So that is an extremely strong argument to be able to present to the rest of the business for why keeping the site fast is a worthwhile, valuable thing to do. So it's rolled out in October of 2016. The business was very happy, and people outside of the FT wrote it up. So I joined the FT in April 2018. It was a great team, still really good technology, still really modern, still shipping really quickly, really good, smart, motivated people, and it was a really good culture. This is our annual Rounders tournament, and it's a really nice place to work, but there were a few problems. So I talked to people, and here are some of the things I heard. People weren't sure of the value of the work. There were areas of code that people didn't want to touch, too gnarly, too scary. There was duplication of code. There was one feature that you had to deploy 3 or 4 microservices in a certain order in order to deploy a feature. So that's not what microservice architecture is meant to be about. So clearly something had gone wrong there. Feature changes felt too bitty. It didn't feel like it wasn't part of a big whole. It was just little bits around the edges. Some of the people who'd set the technical direction had moved on to other projects within the FT, and that gap didn't seem to have been filled. Somebody said to me that she felt like we weren't owning or guiding a system, we were just jamming bits in, and that was kind of echoed in what a lot of other people said. And then the real red flag, like lots of people said, every levels of seniority from different disciplines, not just engineering, we need more developers, which is a real red flag for a lack of focus. So these kind of comments are the 3 main themes in the difficult teenage years. Lack of clear vision, the tech feels like it's drifting off track, and things aren't communicated as well as they used to be. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about strategy for getting out of the difficult teenage years. But before I go into that, I just want to say a brief word on what strategy is. So this is an excellent book, which if you have to form a strategy for anything, you should definitely read. It's very clear about what good looks like in a strategy and how you create a good strategy. But the summary is, a strategy consists of 3 things. A diagnosis, what's the current situation that you find yourself in? A vision, where are you aiming for? And then how to get there. How do you get from your current situation to where you want to be? So we've already talked about the diagnosis. The diagnosis is we're in the difficult teenage years. So now we'll talk about the vision. I'm not going to get into the sort of ins and outs of like vision versus mission or that kind of what word to use. The vision is where you want to get to. It's what good looks like for your project or your product or your team. It's as Tanya said yesterday in her excellent keynote, if you saw it, it's the shining city on the hill. It's where you're heading. You need a vision so that you know what you're aiming for. You need it so that the team know what they're aiming for and why. You need it so that people outside of the team know what you're getting at, what your purpose is. And you need it for yourself so that you know what success looks like. So the vision for launch is very easy to communicate, because when you're when you're launching a new feature to replace an existing, launching a new product to replace an existing product, the vision for launch is something along the lines of everything will be amazing. The new thing is going to replace something that people know the flaws of already, so they will kind of hear what they want to hear. So you say the new site is going to be faster, and they hear that it's also going to fix this particular bugbear that they have about the site. The other reason that the vision is easy to communicate before the launch is that the launch date, there's usually like a date or a milestone or something that means that you're going to launch, and that really clears the mind. It makes it much easier to say, for example, if you're aiming for fast, does this feature you want to add make it faster? No, then it's out of scope for launch. Those conversations are much more straightforward. So next, the team rebuilding the site, next vision for launch was the site was going to be fast, it was going to be responsive, we were going to be able to experiment, and we're going to measure everything. The vision after the launch needs more effort. Reality hits home. It turns out that not everything is amazing. There are some problems that remain unresolved, and people who you said this isn't in scope for launch come back and say, okay, so is it in scope now? So if it's not, you need to have a really clear answer about if it's not about the milestone or the date for the launch, if that feature's out, why is it not out? Why does it not meet the vision? Another reason that the vision after launch is harder to maintain is because goals are not deadlines. So again, using the example of fast, it's not like you make the site fast and then that's it. You never have to do anything else again. Keeping it fast requires maintenance, and what fast means changes over time as well. So you need to put more effort into defending the vision after the launch than you did before the launch. More effort than you might imagine. It also needs to be very, very clear, so you can have those conversations about whether something meets the vision or doesn't. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about how you set the vision for after the launch. It might be that the vision for after launch is just the same as the vision before the launch. So this was the example, this was the case with gov.uk. So the vision for gov.uk is that it would be the best place to find government services and information. And what that means is, as someone who wants to find information about the UK government, you shouldn't need to know about how the UK government is put together. If you want to find out about benefits or tax, you shouldn't need to know that you've got to go to DWP's website for benefits or HMRC's website for tax. You should just go to the government website to find the information about the government. And so that meant for the launch, we replaced the DirectGov website. And then after launch, our vision was the same, and so the next thing we had to do was replace all the other government's websites and move those onto gov.uk as well. So that's the case where the vision is the same after launch as it was before launch. It might be that the vision after launch is similar to the pre-launch vision, or it might be obvious what it is, but it's not the same. So an example of that is CityMapper. So when CityMapper it's an app for working out how to get around, like what's the best public transport or walking route to get from where you want between two places. And initially launched in London. And the vision there was save Londoners from London. And then after the launch, so they launched in London, and then after a while, the next thing they did was launch in New York. So what they say the vision is now is make cities simpler. But internally, it would have been, I mean, I didn't work at CityMapper, but it would have been a clear next vision. So I don't know what it was, but it would have been, first we launched in London, our next vision is to launch in New York. Or it might have been, our next vision is to launch internationally or to launch in another city. So it was clear what it was. It was different, but the next step was clear. But it might be that after the launch, you need a new vision. And that is often the case when you're replacing something. And that was the case with ft.com, because the vision for launch ultimately was replace the old website, which, once you've done that, that's done. That's not the vision for after the launch. So for I'm talking mainly about tech and the tech direction here, but for the product vision on ft.com, we actually brought in an external facilitator to help us refresh the product vision, because we wanted to involve a lot of people in setting the new vision. The reason for that was, I mentioned that lots of people felt they had ownership over the site. Well, before the launch of FT.com, they did have ownership over the site. They owned different bits of it. Now it's run by our team, but we want those people to still feel that they are involved in it, so to feel ownership of it. And so we brought an external facilitator, because if you're going to have a big discussion like that, you need a facilitator. The advantage of getting a lot of people involved in it is that people do feel more ownership over the end result. But the disadvantage is there is a potential for your new vision to end up being designed by committee. So you don't just need a facilitator to facilitate the discussions. You also need somebody who might be the same person, might be someone different, who can write copy, can make sure it sounds good, as well as involving people's thoughts. But you don't need to hire a consultant, and you don't need to do it with a massive team. You can do it with a small team, you can do it yourself. There are lots of good resources for how to work out what your vision is. Actually, one of the best resources is this one on WikiHow. This is actually really good. It's got really good practical advice on what you can do to set a vision. And it says your company, but it doesn't have to be your company. It can be your product, your project, your team, whatever. So the tech vision for FT.com is we want the tech to be maintainable and supportable. We still want it to be fast and responsive, but we want, we're in a new phase now. We want it to be maintainable. We don't want the tech to drift so far off track we have to do another rebuild in a few years. So ultimately, the project to launch this new website was called Next. So our vision basically is no next. So, to summarize what I've said in this section, vision is crucial. You have to work harder to clarify and defend the vision after the launch, but also it's not too late. So we're like 2+ years in after the launch, and we've refreshed the vision. It's not too late to get back on track with that. And also, it's all about communication. You're using the vision to communicate to people where we're heading. Okay, so we're talking about the strategy for getting out of the difficult teenage years. We've talked about the diagnosis. We've talked about the vision. Now we're going to talk about how to get there. So what you need to do is identify the highest impact areas to work on. So just a reminder of some of the features of the difficult teenage years. The tech feels like it's drifting. Corners that you cut to get the site over the line are coming back to bite you now. And also, you might have left things out of the launch deliberately or otherwise that you now need to take into account. So, for example, I've been talking about the FT.com relaunch. The next project was the website, but we didn't look at the apps because they are different technology and we didn't want to boil the ocean. So now we need to make sure that the mobile apps are involved in the next phase for FT.com. So you need to think about what are the areas that you need to focus on now to get to your vision. What are the highest impact steps you can take? So that's what are the things that you can do now that will make other things easier? What are the things that if you don't do them now, they're going to be really difficult or impossible to do later? What are the things that have the biggest impact on more areas? I'm going to talk now about how you can work out what those steps are. Once you have the diagnosis and the vision, it might be obvious to you what the next thing's to do. You might just know. But if not, some things you can do, you can listen to the patterns in what people say. So when I joined, I had a one-to-one with everyone on the team, and I asked them what's going well, what's going badly, and what's about to go badly. And some clear patterns emerged from that, and those were kind of things that I thought these are high-impact areas. Lots of people are talking about this. If we fix this, it will solve a lot of people's problems. Another exercise you can do, this is something we did at DDS, and I did it with my team here, and it's really interesting, where you basically get a small group of people. So we did it with principal engineers and senior engineers on customer products, and you ask people, what are the things we need to do now? And people write them down, and then you lay them out on the floor. So you say, okay, we need to do this in January, we need to do this in February, and then as a group, you literally walk the floor, and you look at and you discuss all the things. And that's really useful for getting the conversations out, having the conversations. People come up with things that other people haven't necessarily thought of, and you have the conversations about, well, actually, we need to do this if we're going to do that, and do we really need to do that now? Can we do that later? So it's quite a long exercise. We did it over an afternoon, but it's really useful. You can send surveys. So I mentioned that there are gnarly areas of code that people don't people are afraid to touch. We decided that we were going to put a small team together to address one of those. And one of the principal engineers sent out a survey asking people, what are the bits you're most afraid of? What do you think this would improve if this worked better, and that kind of thing, and asked people to vote. And that got some really useful information about what to focus on. This is a Spotify health check. Do people know? Hands up if you have heard of the Spotify health check. Okay, so this is Spotify's blog. It's a series of about 12 questions that you just give red traffic light answers to. So, for example, is easy to release. So green means releasing is simple, safe, painless, and mostly automated. Amber means some problems, but it's not a disaster. And red means releasing is risky, painful, lots of manual work, and takes forever. And so you can find the questions on this blog post. What we do is we send it out every 3 months. And it's not very granular, but it's really useful for showing which areas are red and what the trends are. So there's a question about health of the code base, for example, and that shows how people feel about the health of the code base. So that can be really useful for giving you an idea of which are the areas that are going to have the highest impact if you focus on them. Another thing you can do is look for artifacts. So things like tech principles and dashboards are things that are really high impact, because tech principles, if everyone's following the same tech principles, then that really makes a difference to how people work and how people work together. Dashboards are really useful because if you've got dashboards showing how you're performing against your main metrics, then people can see that. If you don't, then that's something would be a good thing to do early on. And then there's a few things to consider after the launch that you might not have considered before the launch because they're related to a live site that aren't related to a site in development. So, for example, how does out-of-hours support work? If your product is something that needs out-of-hours support, then after the launch, your users and the business are going to expect your out-of-hours to be production ready. So that's something you need to address, which you might not have addressed during development. How do you handle critical security vulnerabilities? And how do you act on customer feedback? How do you get customer feedback? So these are kind of things that are important after the launch that might not have been a thing before the launch. You can also measure things, and they will show you things you can focus on. So you can measure things like how frequently do you release, how often does the site go down. A good one is what's the average time it takes for the site to get back up when it does go down. But you have to be careful about measuring things because a metric alone doesn't tell you the full story. So, for example, if you want to see which areas of code people are afraid of, you might want to look at number of commits on a repository. But a low number of commits on a repository or no commits could either mean that it's scary and nobody wants to touch it, or that it's totally stable and nobody needs to touch it. So you can't just take the metric. And so actually something we're working on is improving our measurement. We're looking at ways to measure quality and simplicity. So if anyone's got any useful experience they'd like to share with me, please come and tell me what things that you've measured that gave you useful information. You need to tell people what the next steps are. So it's a new phase. You've launched now. You're in the next phase. And some people will have moved on. Some people are interested in the greenfield build, but they're less interested in this phase, in the maintenance. So some of those people will have moved on to other projects within the company, or they might even have left the company. So it's really important that you communicate what your priorities are, because those people aren't there to have those chats anymore. So the areas we're focusing on ft.com, just a reminder, I said our vision is no next next. So we're working on making our out-of-hours process sustainable. So we have a good out-of-hours process, but it's quite difficult to onboard people. So it's okay at the moment, but if we can't onboard people well, then it's not going to be very sustainable. We're working on refreshing and communicating our tech principles. So we did have tech principles, but we had about 5 slightly different versions in various locations. Lots of them were kind of in slide decks in Google Drive. So we are pulling that together and refreshing those, and then making sure that we communicate them. Poster on the wall. I'm sure there'll be a blog post forthcoming. And as I mentioned, we're working on measuring the quality and simplicity of our systems so that we know so that we can measure that we're improving quality, or measure when we're regressing. And just a reminder, we're 2+ years on from launch, so it is not too late to start, pick the highest impact areas. So to summarize what I've said, the priorities for your tech will be different after the launch than they were before the launch. You should focus on the highest impact areas, and also, it's all about communication. So we've talked about the diagnosis and the vision, and we've talked a bit about how to get there, as in what steps to take. But now we're going to talk about the thing I keep mentioning, which is communication. You must communicate the vision. You must communicate your tech priorities. You need to talk about it more than you think is necessary. You need to repeat yourself until you are bored of your own voice saying it. Because every time you say it, it will be new to someone. Maybe they were in the meeting when you talked about it before, but they weren't listening, they were distracted. Or maybe they were listening and they totally understood it, but they've since forgot it. Or maybe somehow they weren't in any of the conversations you've had about this, they weren't in any of the 57,000 meetings you've already had on this topic. So you need to just keep on talking about it. You need to put in a lot of effort into communicating, more than you might think, both inside your team so that people know what the vision is and what they need to focus on, and outside the team so that people understand where you're going. So I'm going to talk about some ideas about how to communicate. So you can send emails and you can talk to people, but there are some other really good things you can do that help communicate your vision and the steps you're taking to get there. So you can create a wiki page with the vision and the priorities. So on ft.com, we actually use GitHub Wiki, and it's private, so you can only see it if you've got a GitHub license. So what we do now is we nightly publish it to S3 so that anyone in the company can see it. So they can't edit it, but they can see it. So that means we can circulate information outside of only the people who have GitHub licenses, and that's really useful to help communicate. So as open as possible is really good. You can update on your progress in a newsletter. You can either set up a newsletter for the tech progress, or if your team has a newsletter. So we have a customer products newsletter where it's mostly sort of feature releases and things, product-y stuff, but we have a section where we talk about the progress we're making on our tech strategy. You can give regular tech talks. You can give show and tells for inside your team and outside your team. There are loads of things you can do. You can do mugs, you can do posters, you can do stickers. So something at DDS we had stickers for everything. This is Ben Terrett's laptop. We had mission patches, we had stickers about our slogans and things that we believed in. I talked to the Director of Strategy. So Russell Davis used to be the Director of Strategy, and he was behind a lot of the communication at GDS. And he said, it will feel like propaganda to you, but nobody else will notice. And it's true. Like I never felt like it was propaganda. What I felt like when I was working at GDS was that things were really clearly communicated. I knew what we were doing, and I knew where we were going. It never felt like propaganda. So just be aware that on the other side of the communication, you feel boring. Public blog posts are really useful. And I mean, they're interesting for people outside the company, but I think public blog posts are most useful for new starters. Because the stuff that's in the blog post is not stuff that you would necessarily put in the documentation. If the documentation is even in the same place that it was, like the wiki might have moved or it might have been updated. But a public blog post will say, for example, this is the new site, this is why we replaced the old site, and it will give a load of context for someone who knows nothing about it, which is most of the time what a new starter is. So blog about the launch and what it replaced, and blog about technical decisions as you go on. Give talks. Talks are really good. Do talks at conferences. Apply to this conference next year. Talks are really useful for you, the speaker, because it helps you clarify your message and clarify what you're talking about. And it is not too late, as with other things, it is not too late to start communicating better. The only thing about starting communicating later on is that you might have to create some other channels for communication. So if there isn't a newsletter, you might have to start a newsletter. Or if there's no regular tech talks, you might have to set that up. You might need to create a wiki. But all these things are, so there's a little bit of a higher barrier to entry, but it's worth doing, and it's very, very important. So to summarize what I've said in this section, it's all about communication. You can have the best vision and strategy, but if nobody knows about it, it is worthless. Okay, so to summarize, to get out of the difficult teenage years, you need to set a clear vision for after the launch. You need to create a plan that focuses on the highest impact areas, and you need to communicate them. And it is not too late to address any of these things. And it's also not too late to join us on this journey because we're hiring. Thank you.